Hi, this is Ken Wissaker. I'm Senior Executive Editor at Duke University Press, and happy to be here with a group of really wonderful scholars to talk about a book that's just come out called Writing Anthropology, dealing with the themes of writing and ways of writing in the discipline, the multiple ways of writing in the discipline and its history, and the ways we reach different audiences politically and creatively through our writing. The book was edited by Carole McGranahan, and she's joining us today, along with three of the contributors to the book, who will all introduce themselves. Carole, why don't you start?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Carole McGranahan. I'm a professor at the University of Colorado, and I'm editor of the new book, Writing Anthropology, Essays on Craft and Commitment. There are 52 contributors to the book, and I'm excited to be here tonight with three of them, who are now all going to introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Bianca Williams. I'm a professor at the Graduate Center, CUNY, in Anthropology, Critical Psychology, Women and Gender Studies, and I'm one of the contributors to the book. Very excited to be here.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katerina Tewa. I'm an associate professor at the Australian National University in the School of Culture, History, and Language. I'm in Pacific Studies and in Gender, Media, and Cultural Studies there, and I'm excited to join you.
Hi all, my name is Anand Pandian. I teach in the anthropology department at Johns Hopkins University. I've also contributed to this book, and it is really a pleasure to be able to join you all to talk about writing and anthropology. Thank you so much for the invitation.
So having a book with how many contributors? 52?
52. Yeah.
Yes, takes a really different kind of structure and possibility than most books. Lots of books have prehistories, but this book, which to me seems so much of our moment and the desire to write and to the way social media makes anthropological writing available to so many people, it seems right of now. But the book actually has a longer history. Carole, could you tell us a little about that?
Sure. In some ways, this book, it's less of a guilty pleasure than perhaps a selfish indulgence. The book came about actually first as a series, so a series of online essays where I felt like I wanted to talk with my colleagues about writing. I wanted to hear what people were thinking about writing, what their struggles were, what their joys were, and just wanted to basically build community that I felt I needed as I struggled in some of my writing projects. And so I envisioned a writing series on the anthropology blog, Savage Minds, which is now called Anthrodendum, where I would invite a different anthropologist every week to submit an essay. And almost everyone I invited said yes to this, which was wonderful. I invited people I knew. I invited people I had never met before, but whose work I had read and thought they had something to say. I invited people who were known, right, to be like the big stars in writing. And I invited people whose careers were just getting started, both young faculty as well as graduate students. And what I asked everyone to do was just to write something about writing. Like that was as simple a prompt as I gave to everyone. And everyone came back with something pretty unique and pretty wonderful. And so the series ran for 2 years, so 2 academic years, not 12 months, and ended up generating just this wonderful collection of essays that I thought, this needs a life beyond just existing online. And so, posed it in a phone conversation to Ken. Ken, what do you think? And he thought, this has promise. And we talked about what the book might look like and then, set about to make it happen. So there's part of the origin story.
One of the interesting things about writing to me in anthropology was it is possible to at least imagine backwards a time where there was a kind of standard form of writing that you had to have a structural functionalist, like what the arc of the book would be. And now we have a really welcome kind of opening for how books could be structured in lots of different ways. I was at a conversation also on Zoom yesterday with Yarmar Bonilla and Lawrence Ralph, and they were talking about what was their continuing attachment to anthropology. And it was that way of the kind of not just one thing, the possibility of using concepts and the openness of it. And it struck me, and the book really talks about that, how that openingness is both really a challenge and a space of possibility. And I think everyone here has really used that in different ways in their own work and thought about it in different ways. And maybe people could talk about that a little. Bianca, did you want to start?
So what led me to anthropology was that space for creativity. I don't do too well with the very rigid way of writing. So wanting to be able to write and also utilize people's textures of the everyday, for me, is what keeps me here. The ethnographic lens, the creative writing. And you see a lot of that show up in the book, people's different takes on kind of ethnography and creative writing. So in my book, The Pursuit of Happiness, there's interludes in between the chapters. And I felt like anthropology was the one place where I could do that and it would make sense for the theoretical project. Carole said that everyone said yes to her prompt. She kind of had to fight me because I have a lot of writing resistance. And so we were colleagues at the University of Colorado Boulder. And I was having a really tough time writing a piece. And she was like, well, why don't you write about it? And I said, I think that's counterintuitive to the anxiety that I'm having right now. And she said, no, I think you should write about it. And so that opening of being able to be reflexive, to be able to write about what I was experiencing in the moment without feeling like I had to use, the big high theory words, that there was meaning and theory in the everyday experience was what led me to write about writing anxiety in the shower in my chapter.
Katerina, what do you think?
I definitely can relate to writing resistance or resistance to writing. So immediately connect there. Before I go into that, I want to say that I'm speaking from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country here in Canberra, and it's always really important for me to position myself geographically, time zone wise, and in terms of Indigenous relations. And because I'm Indigenous to the Pacific, I have this awkward almost a resistance to anthropology. And so my pathway into anthropology might be a bit different from others in that I did my PhD in the British system, I suppose, or an Antipodean system based in Australia, which has more of a British social anthropology kind of background and context, and is one in which critical Pacific studies scholars tend to resist quite a lot and have a lot of critique of. And so I ended up in anthropology because in our system, you end up in the field that your supervisor is in. So you apply to work with someone and then you end up in the field where your potential supervisor is situated. It's a very different kind of program from, US anthropology training, and you kind of have this one-on-one relationship with your supervisor and do nothing but research for 3 to 4 years rather than taking courses and getting all the background and, situating yourself within a genealogy of thought or theory or method. It's a much more open and extremely independent kind of doctoral journey. So I came out of that context, and in a way that gave me a lot of space to take a more transdisciplinary approach to the whole thing, where I could stay committed to the kinds of values of resistance that came out of my critical Pacific studies training at the University of Hawaii, where there were a lot of people who were very resistant to anthropology, and rightly so, because anthropology functions in a particular kind of way in the Pacific. So my anxiety around anthropology was very justified based on my experience at the ANU as someone who was would speak up to some of the ideas that I would hear from my senior colleagues about how things are in the Pacific. And if you know, globally, the Pacific is kind of this place where you cut your teeth in anthropology. If you do your fieldwork in Papua New Guinea, you occupy a particular, kind of status within the field. So I kind of pushed back against all of those ideas about about anthropology in the Pacific, and kind of created a space where I could do things my way, utilizing creativity, transdisciplinary approaches. The book I ended up writing has a whole chapter, which is just a remix of quotes and images and fragments from history. So I very much relate to, what Bianca was saying about having kind of this awkward relationship with the writing and the expectations around writing, and trying to do anthropology in a completely different way, and then learning from the various battles that emerged around trying to do anthropology my way in the context which I'm in Australia.
Anand, you've written in about 4 different genres, maybe 5 by now. And how do you choose? What do you see as the challenge each time? How do you fit the subject and the project with a genre?
That's an interesting question. It's, to be perfectly candid, this has been a very hard summer in terms of writing for me. I'm sure we all feel that way. And I would say, in terms of genre, the only genre that I have managed to write, if not successfully, then at least regularly in this summer, is the tweet. Because there's something about the length of the tweet, the temporality of the tweet, its containedness, that seems to work well with the absurdly distracted and distracting circumstances that we're living in right now. When I say we, I mean my own household. I don't know if you can hear my children playing violin downstairs. They're in online school right now. I'm teaching. Supposedly, it's a real mess, and that is something though that I have thought about and even written a bit about. When I was working with another book that Ken was kind enough to publish called Real World a few years ago, which was based on ethnographic work with South Indian filmmakers, one of the things that I was trying to show in that project was that there was very much a kind of ecology of creative process, that whatever it was that emerged as cinema could only emerge as a material embodiment and response of the circumstances in which that work arose. And I think that argument can be made for writing as much as for anything else. So I suppose the answer to the question would be that the choice of genre isn't purely volitional. It has to do with an attunement to circumstance and to find a way of working creatively with the limits that we have at hand. Having said that, having certainly found a great deal of space in anthropology to think and work and write creatively now, I also think it's important to try to emphasize that that space has actually been there in the discipline for quite a long time, and that we have these ways even now of talking about the history of anthropology as though things were much more orthodox and canonical, and then thank God they got more experimental and open. But when we do that, we capitulate to dominant narratives that have excised genre-defying work from the very outset of the discipline as not properly anthropological. So in my department here at Hopkins, I'm teaching, and again, teaching in square quotes because it's just hard, sorry, not square quotes, air quotes, I guess. This is how addled I am right now. I'm teaching the introductory anthropology class here at Hopkins. We've got 100 undergraduates. We've got a lecture tomorrow morning. And so how to begin this introduction, this introductory syllabus, how to set it up, how to do so at this moment when writing and scholarly expression has become so charged with political stakes and significance. I decided to start the book with two books that don't quite fit the mold, in fact, but are very much from the early 20th century. One being Water Lily by Ella Cara Deloria, and the other being Barracoon by Zora Neale Hurston, both of which were only published very recently in 1988 and 2018, were in fact written in the early decades of the 20th century by important figures trained in anthropology at Columbia, and I think ought to have recognition as having an important place in the ongoing multiplication of questions of style and voice and form that the discipline has made room for.
Carole, it strikes me as Anand is talking that the writing of the title is both people's own practice, so Bianca talking about her own practice, and then the writing to be read, which of course is to be read by whom. So as could be, as Katerina said, that who's the audience for that writing? What do you need from them? And in putting together the range of things in the book, you must have found quite a different set of kind of naturalized assumptions about like what to concentrate on writing would be, and then who that writing was supposed to be for. And, you know, part of that I think historicizes as well, because I can remember times when writing was opposed to theory, whereas now writing and theory seem to go together really well. And, you know, you would say, oh, Fred Moten is very writerly, the same way you might say somebody who was trying to write poetry was very writerly. So I'm wondering how you feel like it's in process and changing, and what you're seeing as the different varieties or in your own practice.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think we are in a moment, and actually have been in it for quite some time, right? This is not a pandemic moment, but a moment maybe of the last, at least of the last 5 years, but maybe the last decade or so. I think it's sparked in some ways by this question of audience, right, and who we write for, of the ability to reach new audiences now, or to reach audiences in new ways. So old audiences in new ways, as well as new audiences because of technology, right, digital technology. So I think that's one of the things that's part of the story, as well as it's not so much, to come back to something that Anand was saying, we tell and retell and shape and reshape the history of the discipline, and perhaps all disciplines do it, but I know anthropology does it really well, right? And so, you know, we come up with new versions of who we are and what we do and what it is we're pushing against, right? And so sometimes we end up, you know, rediscovering people. And here, you know, so I write about some of these things actually in the introduction, right? So kind of the way that actually there was a writerly approach in anthropology, you know, going back 100 years. And we sometimes forget that and think that we are pioneering something, or we forget that someone like Ruth Bahar and Debbie Gordon, right, were writing about this in the 1980s, right? And kind of thinking about women writing culture and that volume kind of that followed writing culture. But I think that right now, Ken, to kind of come to thinking of, if just to stay with the subtitle, craft and commitment. What's the commitment part? Like if the craft is the practice, right? Like how we're writing, what it feels like to be writing, what our struggles are in the writing. The commitment is more about the purpose, right? The goals, and the community, who it is we're writing with, who it is we're writing for. If we know that writing is generative of ideas, you know, of our own, and many people write about that in the book. So I think a lot of the writing's not, or me anyways, the writing and the ideas in the essays are not conventional, right? And if you just think of Catherine Besteman's essay, the one that closes the book, where she starts out by saying, what if I told you to write something you don't know? Right, where she, like, that's her prompt, to write what you don't know, right, and kind of the paralysis of like that and the counterintuitive nature of it. but the idea that we are generating our ideas, of course, as we write, and we sort of already know that, right? That's not necessarily new, but the generative thing of taking the ideas into the world and seeing where they go. In both responsibility to community, the communities with whom you've done this research, you know, who have given you permission, who have welcomed you into their community with care and with trust, to honor that. And I think that's the part to me that really, when I was trying to think of a subtitle for this, and I don't know, Ken, if you remember you and I going back and forth several times on what should a book of 52 essays that are widely varied, at least in terms of topic, be titled. And it came down to me to, there's an idea of commitment that really does, it's threaded throughout. And these essays do cover wide ground, you know, from the experience of what it means to call yourself a real writer, to what it means to be writing in the field. And I'm thinking of Eva Juicy Knight's essay or Kim Fortune's essay, right, of being there. What did Sienna Craig on being a reliable narrator or not. And so a commitment to tell a story in a way that's not so much right or correct, but true. Right, to the communities, not just who it's about, but who are going to receive this, right? And for whom these stories we're telling, this writing we're doing is going to do some work in the world. And to me, that feels a little different than what anthropology felt like when I was an undergraduate, maybe in the 1980s. And I think when we talk about like formulaic scientific writing, like I kind of go straight to the 80s, right? A little bit to kind of, you know, then there was a formula. And that may or may not be true, but we always have to have some sort of, you know, something that we do hold up as the bad guy and then essentialize as, well, anthropology is this. But even if we just hold that as the period from which we've moved, you know, to the now, there is a different sense of, I think, both possibility as well as politics. Not that those weren't there before, but how we're living them and what we're hoping and some of us demanding, like from those, has shifted.
Well,
certainly when I look at the writings of Anand and Bianca and Katerina, I mean, like all three of you, you know, just like bringing ideas, commitments, and voices, you know, into the world.
I was thinking about this, especially we're in North America, but the moments of commitments that are we're really called to, especially now, and the way that puts a different kind of weight on the writing in terms of who the writing's for and what one needs to do. And maybe Katerina, since you're not in North America, you could start and talk about how that kind of sense of community and who it's for, and if it's not for the anthropologists at ANU, like who you think about when you're writing.
Absolutely. When Carole was speaking, it reminded me of the late Professor Martin Silverman, who passed away in 2018, who wrote a really important book about my community, the Banabans, and the impacts of their displacement from Kiribati to Fiji in 1945. And he wrote it in the context of symbolic anthropology. Very, very few Banabans have anything to say about it, unfortunately, because it's completely inaccessible. Most people cannot read it. But there's so much important stuff in Martin Silverman's work, and he was a lovely human, and everyone liked him. And, you know, he came and hung out on the island. He met my father, and I saw him apparently as a 2-year-old in my house and said something like, "Oh, I have 2 daddies," which is the weirdest thing to say when you see a new person in your house. But then to end up as the first Banaban anthropologist, you know, like decades later, is kind of, you know, it's quite surreal for me. But when Carole was speaking, it reminded me that even still today, we cannot access a lot of the really important ideas in Martin's book, because he was writing in a particular kind of theoretical way. And when I started doing my research at the ANU, when I encountered, you know, ethnographic information written by others or information in the archives. I did a lot of archival work. as well, stuff that had been written by colonial officials, you know, in the early 1900s about Banabans. I didn't see any of it as writing. I had this really like existential experience where I saw it visually. Like, so any content that came to me by people who'd written about Banabans in the past appeared in very, very visual ways, even if it was textual. So what I kept trying to do was animate these characters and these peoples and these events in all the content that I was encountering in my research, and I was trying to bring them back to life. And so this metaphor of like kind of cinematic reanimation of people of the past, whether they were Banabans or colonial officials or Martin Silvermans or, you know, travel writers, became a way for me to take research and the content of the research and make it accessible to people in the Pacific, but particularly Banabans. So whatever I did, there was always a visual version either happening in real life or happening in my head. And I remember at the time doing visual anthropology as well. So I produced my work as 7 visual studies on DVD in 2002, along with 100,000 word text, which was writing overkill, big time. You didn't need 100,000 words and a 90-minute, you know, visual anthropology product out of this research. So I did these like double, you know, I did a double kind of PhD. And only now in, you know, 2020 is the fruits of my visual, choreographic, embodied labor that went into the DVD being realized and celebrated. A lot of people tell me, you were doing stuff then that only people now, because of the internet and TikTok and tweeting and all of that, now it makes sense to people. When I did it back then, because I was trying to make our stories accessible, stories that have been written by others accessible, now it makes sense because the visual is useful. Everyone operates within the visual now because shorter is better. You know, when Anand was talking about how tweeting makes sense, tweeting makes so much sense to me on so many different levels. It's like, that's the attention span. That's the requirement to be extremely concise and pithy and critical, you know, in a short space of words. So I have been trying to do that work constantly, but my motivation is telling stories that matter. And I remember, you know, in Carole's introduction to the book, her talking about, I think it was a conversation between you and Anne Stoller about, you know, telling stories that matter. And for me, the Banaban story of a very, very small people from the Pacific is a story that matters, but it has to be accessible. It has to be made relevant, you know, globally, so that people don't just dismiss it as another little story about little non-urban people from the Pacific. So that's what motivates me to play with form, to translate content into other forms of knowledge, while also acknowledging and drawing upon Pacific modes of storytelling, which are not just in writing, or weren't in writing until writing, you know, was brought to the Pacific, but have been told through song and dance, through embodied ways, through tattooing, through architecture, through all of these different forms. I try to integrate and bring all of those things together in the way I do my academic work, in terms of how I practice what I do, which is very transdisciplinary. Yeah.
No, that's fantastic. Bianca, I was thinking back about your project and your book and its afterlife, and like when we first met and you were talking about it, who the imagined audience might have been versus the way it's gotten picked up on Twitter. And you must have heard from many different kinds of people than you ever might have first imagined was the readership. And I wondered if you might talk about that a little, on how it's changing how you think about writing now.
Mm-hmm. So Carole says in the book, writing is accountability and ethical practice. And part of what was really difficult in writing The Pursuit of Happiness being a Black woman who's theorizing about Black women's experiences was that feeling of like deep responsibility of wanting to speak to and alongside and with community, feeling like you wanted to represent them in all their truths in a way that didn't police their behavior and was very honest about the ways we both resist forms of oppression and also perpetuate and are implicated in forms of oppression. So all of that was constantly in my head as I was trying to write the book. And yeah, now that it's been published out, I've gotten both good and bad feedback from numerous people on Twitter, at talks, about how they feel about the very small slice of Black women's experiences that are in that text. And more recently, as I work on the next book on radical honesty, what has come up for me. So Kristen Smith, who found Cite Black Women, which is a collective that has been really moving, initiating a very fiery discussion about the erasure and plagiarism of Black women's work in multiple disciplines, but including anthropology, and Lynn Bull's piece in 2013 in Transforming Anthropology about the lack of citation of Black women anthropologists' work in anthropology, and yet we're picked up in all these other disciplines. That thinking around citation as a type of sign of disciplinary belonging or academic belonging. I think I was talking about this earlier, like why, like if Zora is often lifted up as the person who, you know, really challenged a lot of the rigid ideas of anthropology. But there's so many of us that are in her genealogy, and it's not this historical exclusion that's happening. It's a very present exclusion and pushing out from the discipline that's happening. And so thinking about the ways that commitment to communities outside of the academy that happen, that may be Black, that may be brown, being committed to doing political work, committed to doing what we call, I guess, public anthropology, committed to speaking to audiences that are not necessarily inside the academy. That commitment for a lot of Black women has kept us from not being seen and recognized as anthropologists. And so thinking about writing as a tool of community making and being committed and accountable to a group, but also thinking about citation as part of that writing practice that's about community and accountability. And the piece that I'm late on right now, if the editors are watching, they're like, you should have turned this in last week. But the piece that I'm procrastinating on right now and having anxiety about right now is about citation as disciplinary belonging and citation as theoretical genealogy, and the ways that all of us who follow in Zora's lineage are often pushed out into other disciplines like Africana studies or women and gender studies or ethnic studies, because our writing and even our citation practices, the way that we cite one another and create that genealogy, is seen as anti-anthropology or not in line with what anthropology is. So surprisingly, the pursuit of happiness is very much talked about by a lot of anthropologists, but I find that people in other disciplines do engage me more around it. And it always makes me think about what it means that certain people, certain bodies, certain issues, certain types of writing are still not seen as anthropological.
That's really helpful. I think you've done a lot to actually change that, and the feeling of right now, and like all of the people who, like Deb and John, have encouraged through their careers. It feels much different to me in a really good way, and the way Christina Sharp being in Vancouver back when AAA was in person seemed like the central event. My hope and effort is that is something that's changing. Anand, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to thank you for that. And I was going to say part of what I really like about writing Anthropology, the book, but also the people that you mentioned who are my mentors, John and Deb and Lee Baker, is that it really does take us to both publish about these kind of things, about writing, about citation, about teaching and pedagogy, about methodology, about the things that oftentimes get gendered as feminine or racialized and marginalized as like what folks of color do in anthropology. Those things, it really takes us publishing about them and then training our graduate students to know that doing it differently is okay, to open up the path for doing it differently. So I appreciate that you think I have done something to push that forward, but it really did take the generation before me and even 2 generations before me to kind of make room and make that okay. And I think this book is kind of part of that genealogy.
Absolutely. So Anand, since you've in all the different books kind of engaged a little different publics, but I feel like the level of political commitment in your work has risen a lot in recent years with the political situation. How are you thinking about that now going forward?
Well, if I think about if I think about Bianca and Katerina's contributions to this particular book that Carole edited, to writing anthropology, one thing that I think that they both have in common is their commitment to vulnerability, or their willingness to sit with the vulnerability of the author, which is a vulnerability in the face of a potential reader, which is a vulnerability with regard to circumstance, which both of them wrote about quite poignantly, but which is also, I would say, a vulnerability with regard to the situations and the people that we write about. And thinking back to the story that Katerina was telling about this anthropologist who had come and done this symbolic anthropological work that was really completely hermetic and impossible to access locally, and yet one could experience such a person as another father in that circumstance. To me, stories like that, which I think we've heard plenty of with regard to the discipline and its history and the way that it's touched down in different places, attest to the relationship between the political challenge of decolonizing anthropology, which Faye Harrison invited us to think about so importantly many years ago at this point, and the challenge that is posed in a book like this one, the writerly challenge of actually reaching a more diverse set of people. And to me, the fulcrum, the point, not the fulcrum really, but the point where those two challenges intersect is precisely the question of who we imagine as our peers when we write. And I don't think that a decolonial anthropology or a decolonization of anthropology as a discipline will be possible until we can not only imagine, but actually practice, engage in a writing practice that takes our interlocutors as peers and as potential receivers, or as potential conversational partners in what it is that we wind up writing. And to get back then to Ken's question about politics and about political commitment, to me, there is a bit of a kind of form content problem here. I think it's one thing for anthropologists to begin to write about political matters, to begin to respond to issues of concern. A lot of us are trying to do that. Some people have been doing it for quite a while. We lost David Graeber very recently, for example, right? And it's wonderful to see all of the things that people have been saying about his work and about his legacy over the last few days, including Rebecca Solnit today in The Guardian. So it's one thing to write politically, or to write about politics, to write about matters that have political stakes, but there's also that politics of writing that has to do with questions of voice and accessibility and really the ethos that we carry as writers. And my feeling is that for us to really see a fuller realization of a more political anthropology, really need to approach the very practice of writing in a more lateral and egalitarian spirit.
Can I add to that?
Sure.
Yeah, thank you so much for kind of bringing that together so concisely, because we've been talking so much about writing, and my chapter is about reading. So my chapter in this book is about reading, not writing. And that's because my struggle is with reading. My struggle is with the whole concept of literacy to begin with, and the politics of literacy and the power of literacy, because as an academic, there's an assumption that we are all reading and consuming each other's work, other works. We're reading texts. And my struggle is with reading texts, which is like the basic fundamental 101 of what's required as an academic. So even before writing, The struggle around reading is a struggle around dealing with what constitutes important knowledge production, knowledge that means something and that has power. And there's, you know, in spite of us living in the the age of multimedia everything remix, there's still an assumption in the academy about the power of the text and about the power of constructing things, you know, top to bottom, left to right, within a particular kind of logic of form. So the idea of, you know, accessibility is so important and so powerful right now because of the information overload and the misinformation that's happening, that's shaping, you know, the globe right now in terms of the politics, in terms of the resistance to science, in terms of pushback against climate change. Like, it's all falling apart. And there's so much amazing content, analysis, thought, and whatever in the academy that's so inaccessible, you know, especially in the cultural, political, you know, the space of race, culture, gender, everything. And so it's, you know, I feel like one of the most important things academics can do right now is make things accessible and dismantle this idea of the hierarchy of knowledge production in terms of the ways things are written, in terms of the way things are cited, in terms of what theory is at all. And I know anthropology's gone through, well, mainly cultural anthropology. Again, you know, there's different kinds of anthropology in different parts of the world, but American cultural anthropology has gone through these conversations about what are we, what do we do, how do we do it, how do we speak, how do we write? And there's also been pushback against that. But it's been partly a process of anthropology looking back onto itself, as opposed to thinking more about the politics of the impact of knowledge and of the need for the accessibility. And that sometimes is the hardest thing to do, given the type of training and disciplining that goes on in all disciplines, right? So when you're disciplined, even if you want to be more accessible, it's hard because of the disciplining factor, which is the hoop you jump through to function and move up through the academy and get published, right? By writing in a particular type of style and structure and form and all of that. So I just feel like, you know, one of the things that, you know, that you put out there in terms of prompting us to think about what's happening now, today, everything in the world, challenging the form for me is the thing. Challenging the form is the political thing we need to do. And it's the form that's the hardest. When my thesis went out for examination and it was examined by creative, engaged senior scholars, they didn't know what to say about my 7 visual studies on DVD. I got no feedback about that. All the feedback was about the text. Because even if they also were into practicing things differently, the disciplining factor kind of focused them back on the text and on thinking about, does this pass, as opposed to my visual, embodied, creative, choreographic work passing. So for me, it's the form. The form is what we have to, you know, think about, deal with, dismantle, and reimagine. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. What I've loved as a publisher, though, is the way this is a kind of open moment. So I've seen Anna Tsing's Mushroom Book at what is otherwise an art and hip poetry bookstore in the East Village. You see Donna Haraway being taken up by everyone. You see Beth Pavanelli's films with her Aboriginal collective at PS1 MoMA. You know, so that the politics that might be in Katie Stewart's Ordinary Affects, and who could read that, it doesn't, there isn't just one answer to the way that the style and politics and audience go together. Person who's going to read Amy Cox's Shapeshifters and be moved by that might find that compelling reading, even if you like just kind of projected who's going to read, you would get something different. And I think that just multiplies with the kind of multimedia possibilities. Carole, were you?
Well, I was thinking as Katerina talked that this is one of the things that is up to all of us, right? Is to work together to insist that multiple forms are possible. And I think ethnography actually opens itself to that in so many beautiful ways. So when I teach Bianca's book to my graduate students, they then say something like, oh, well, we can't write like this, or we can't write this until we have tenure, right? They'll say something like that to me. And I said, well, you don't know that. This is a conversation you have to have with your advisor, right? And you have to have with your committee, right? What would it mean to write a dissertation that doesn't look like, again, a formulaic dissertation? And as Bianca said before, right, this is also something that's in progress. Right? It's not something we're starting right here, certainly not in this book or even this conversation, but something that's been in motion with different kind of ebbs and flows, but is a moment we're in now where I think Katerina's right. Form is something that has opened in ways that ethnography has not just been receptive to, but has been probably like the inspiration for. Right? Because the way that people experience their life and narrate it to us, whether it's through words or through tattoos or through dance or whatever way they're communicating with us, right? It's not in a singular form. And we haven't been good about respecting all of those ways, right, that stories are coming to us. We are the ones who have been putting them into formulas that they were never in the first place. And I think allowing ourselves to kind of to recognize that and to undo it has been, healthy, right, to say the least, but also has been political, right, to now come back to Anand's project. Like that's actually a political statement, right, to not just say, I'm going to put voices in here of the people with whom I spoke, but I'm actually going to try to, again, to write with and to rethink form and to bring a sense of ethnography into the world, in a way maybe I felt it as a researcher, right? And to try and give that to the reader, again, regardless of who the reader is, right? Or how they're encountering your work, whether we're presenting it, I do a lot of talks, for example, to the Tibetan community. So I present my work a lot, my research a lot, ongoing, completed, in progress, to the community. And so some read what I write and some engage me in conversation and some engage me over social media, right? Like what are all the ways, right, that we talk about what we're learning and what we're actually doing, right, with the knowledge that's shared with us.
Bianca?
I was hearing Carole's graduate students in my head. And I'm faculty lead for the Publix Lab, which is an initiative at the Graduate Center where we take graduate students in their first or second years of grad school across multiple humanities and social science disciplines and try to provide them with resources to think very broadly about what their careers are going to be, whether inside, outside, beyond, trans, the academy. And it's really interesting because what I find, I work with the faculty mentors, and what I find as I talk to people in English and anthropology and all the different disciplines is the hardest thing to get faculty and academics to do is to think more creatively about things like prelim exams, dissertations, and really if we're going to question and push and expand and really just kind of blow up and out what we consider writing, theoretical writing to be. I tell them all the time, you have all this money for these public programs and you want to work with these communities and you want to do these wonderful things that a lot of us do as public scholars, but just sitting in a faculty meeting for maybe a course of 4 weeks and reimagining what you're asking your graduate students to do for their milestones is where the real change can actually happen. And that's where you see people's old, like they're really stuck in these traditional, because what happens if they don't know how to write a 300-page dissertation that may possibly turn into a book? That's where people's like really deeply embedded values and disciplining around what is anthropology or English or whatever, or what deserves a PhD is really stuck. That's where you see people, departments having fights, generational rifts around what we should count as a proposal. And so it's amazing to me that, you know, in a moment, I'm trying my best to have really good hope in humanity right now. But being in New York since March with the pandemic and all this violence that police and state-sanctioned forces have done against Black people, my hope was that we would really slow down in this moment and completely reimagine our relationship with work, with knowledge, with organizing and all these things. And I have seen the opposite, where we're failing people in this experiment. But when I think about writing and when I think about anthropologists who I know, who I work with collaboratively and alongside, who are really thinking deeply about abolition and thinking about restorative justice and transformative justice and just different ways of being in the world and being in community, not only with folks outside the academy, but with one another, I think we have a moment. This is an opening to do it differently. But sometimes we're so focused on the things, the shiny ways of being different that get grant funding, that get people in, you know, journals and magazines and, you know, whatever. We're not considering the really deep, tiny places that are super powerful, like prelim exams and dissertations, and what you teach your students in the core theory courses. What do you bring people from community? Do you bring anthropologists who are practicing anthropologists into your core theory courses and have them teach how they use, you know, the canonical texts? Who convinced you that Black feminist theory wasn't part of the canon? Like, these questions around how we train people are really super important. And if you're into the new sexy thing of abolition, and I hope you're deeply studying it, if you're thinking about that, then I need people to really consider what those new imagined practices look like in their work and to do it differently.
If I could just jump in for a moment.
Sure enough.
I want to actually then make a plug for this book, because I think that one of the most brilliant things about this book as a book is that it gives these short slivers of invitation to do exactly what Bianca is talking about right now, which is to enter into a very different kind of writing practice, thinking practice, narrative practice that exists or coexists in the volume side by side with much more orthodox modes of proceeding. This is not a book, Carole's book, Writing Anthropology, is not a book that one can read cover to cover. Because to read a book like this, in my experience, or to try to read it cover to cover, is actually a very jarring experience, precisely because of the enormous and almost incommensurable differences that it contains. And that's precisely, I think, what makes it valuable in terms of pedagogy, to say that all of this has a place. And these folks may not be speaking the same language. They may not be speaking in terms, in fact, or putting their positions forward in ways that are mutually commensurable. And yet they do have a place in this business of writing anthropology. In some ways, I would say, in terms of its narrative form, what it reminded me of actually is the book Changing Planes, which is one of the later works of fiction by Ursula Le Guin, where there are people who are nominally at an airport, but every time they take a flight, they wind up in a different reality. And those realities exist side by side, and they're simultaneous. But the point is, they are different worlds. And it's really lovely as a reader, I think, to get a tangible sense of that range of style, of voice, of endeavor, with such pace in a volume like this. So kudos to Carole for that.
I have to say that was very beautiful and a beautiful place to end. I've been watching the time, and I really want to thank all of you. This was really great. We got to some very deep places, which is good, and also opened up some possibilities. And I urge everybody to take a look and read through the book, jump around in it, and find more to find for themselves. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks, Ken, and thanks everyone for being here and for listening.